Welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar for today. We're going to allow people to join us for another moment and then we'll kick things off. Once again, welcome everyone. We will be waiting one more moment before we kick things off. All right, well, we seem to have gotten most of the participants on. So hello, everyone. My name is Baridula Dube. I'm the training specialist here at Grounded Solutions Network, and you have arrived for our webinar today, Telling Stories with Your Data, COVID-19 Considerations. Next slide. Grounded Solutions Network is an organization that works nationally, connecting local experts with the network's knowledge and support they need. We promote housing solutions that will stay affordable for generations so communities can stabilize and strengthen their foundation for good. Next slide. And this webinar features our HomeKeeper program staff. And HomeKeeper is both a program of Grounded Solutions Network and is also a Salesforce app and HUD-approved client management system for various homeownership and housing counseling programs. It can also be used to manage emergency and rental assistance programs. HomeKeeper also helps homeownership and housing counseling programs manage their day-to-day work and measure their impact. Next slide. We will briefly zoom through the Zoom tips, as many of you have hopefully been using Zoom these past few months. So use an Ethernet cord or sit as close to your Wi-Fi router as possible. Please stop and mute your video if you aren't speaking, and this webinar is being recorded. If you have any ongoing audio issues, consider dialing in or having the system call your phone. And if you are on a tablet or phone, some of the options will be in different places. Next slide. As I mentioned, we recommend that you connect your audio by, excuse me, through your computer audio by selecting the computer audio button at the top of the pop-up window or by having the conference call you. Next slide. And at the bottom of the screen, you have all the options you need. So you can mute yourself, stop your video. If you click on participants, you'll see a whole host of options that I'll show you on the next slide. At any moment, you can use the chat to ask any questions of the presenters or any of your fellow participants, and you can also share any reactions. So next slide, I will show the participation feature. So as I said before, if you go to the bottom and you click on participants, at the bottom of that panel on your right, you will see all these options. Particularly, you might want to raise your hand if you would like to ask a question later in today's webinar. Next slide. And lastly, we do encourage you to use the chat or raise your hand, and we want this to be as much of a collaborative learning space as possible. And we'll also have a Q&A time as well. So without further ado, I'll go through our agenda and introduce the rest of us, and we'll kick this thing off. So today we'll be setting the stage. We'll talk about COVID-19 context and tracking, telling stories with data, story types and themes. Then we'll have questions and discussion, and we'll close and share any additional resources. So next slide. The three of us today, like I said, I'm Baridula Dube. I'm this training specialist, and I'll allow Tiffany and Lindsay to unmute themselves and say hello as well.
Hi everyone, this is Tiffany Ng. I'm here in smoky Oakland, California. I'm the director of HomeKeeper at Grounded Solutions Network.
Hi everybody, I'm Lindsay Griggs. I'm the HomeKeeper customer success specialist at Grounded Solutions Network, and I'm coming to you today from Arvada, Colorado.
Awesome. So it's now time for you guys to introduce yourselves. So please introduce yourselves in the chat. Feel free to drop your name, your organization, your location. And to get us kicked off thinking about what we're going to chat about today is, what's one data point or data set you would like to explore more? So we have a couple of examples here at the bottom of the slide: occupation, race, applicant/client zip code, the number of households requesting COVID-related reports. So I will watch the chat to see as people introduce themselves. I know it might take a moment to type that out. And I know we are a smaller group, so I'll also ask if anybody would like to raise their hand or unmute themselves and just introduce yourself out loud. Thank you. I see some things coming in the chat. Once again, feel free, anyone, if they want to unmute themselves and introduce themselves in the chat. Let me see. So welcome, Michelle, Christina, and Karen. Thank you for introducing yourselves. Okay, well, I think the chat will keep going. I know it takes a long to type, but I will go ahead and pass it along to Tiffany.
Great, thank you. So let's see here. Thanks also for registering. At the time you registered, we did gather some of the stories that you wanted to talk about or that you're thinking about, particularly in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I've listed some of them here. Feel free to add more examples as you're thinking through your data stories and introductions into the chat box. But we did gather the stories and we incorporated some of these into the planning for this session. Just wanted to note that. All right, so thanks again for joining us. So I really, as you know, want to focus today on the stories that you're telling in this era of COVID-19. And before we get too far into it, I know there's been a big spotlight on the importance of data in the midst of this pandemic. I think you've all seen that in the news. We've seen how it helps us benchmark our progress in beating back the virus, and we've seen the tragic realities revealed of the deadly impact it's had on Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples in particular. So this obviously on top of so many other layers of injustice in housing and healthcare. So I do appreciate you taking the time to be here. We know it also takes time to pull together stories and narratives, and that takes away from your other urgent tasks. But the pandemic has elevated the importance of good data, of current and comparable data to advance positive change. So right now, I know you're being called on to share data and stories with your stakeholders and the media and the legislature, particularly as relief is being contemplated by our government. So I assure you, your stories will make a difference, and I do appreciate you all joining us. Let's see. So first off, I wanted to make the case that all of us need to be tracking the impact of COVID-19 and this pandemic on our work. Get those systems in place now. We've seen that when we lack the data, we lack the answers. So, as an example, by simply failing to track something as simple as whether or not someone is a healthcare worker, we have really been so far unable to fully measure the toll of the pandemic on our front lines. So yeah, when we lack the data, we lack the answers, and the same goes for your programs and organizations or agencies where you work. So we can do this, we can do it better. Your clients and communities are counting on you, and with a few adjustments, you'll have the data you need to share with others the effects in your work. So specifically, we're recommending that all programs put into place now, so those systems that allow you to identify or flag households or cases and activities as they relate to COVID-19 at the time of intake or when you first start working on a new program. So systematically tracking how your families or individuals that you work with are being impacted will help you measure your response. So really, there's not too much to overthink here. The key is to segment the data and reporting so you can isolate your data and report before, during, and after the pandemic. If you're a HomeKeeper user, we have released a few new ways to do that. If you didn't hear about our latest release, but if you don't have that option, you can use tags in your notes or in your case files or spreadsheets or whatever you need to do to gather this information. If you're already tracking COVID-19 data points within your programs, feel free to share in the chat box how you're doing that, what metrics you're using. But for some inspiration, where I'm heading with this point is that the goal is really to be able to tell a data-driven story at the end of the day. As one example, Opal Community Land Trust, one of our HomeKeeper organizations from Washington, created a new community emergency rental and mortgage assistance program. So they've so far distributed $196,169 in housing assistance grants, paying 208 months of rent or mortgage payments for 381 people in 123 families in their community. And having the data to tell a story like this one, while probably unmanageable a year ago, is really critical for attracting support. So Opal, if you're on the call, shout out to you for all of your great work. If you want to know more about this, we did write a blog on our website about how you could implement this or other thoughts that we have. And you can, again, post questions in the chat box. All right, so I think we are going to move on to telling data stories. And we're going to focus on how to write a good story. And we've pulled together our learnings and your examples to help guide us today. So over the last 10 years, our HomeKeeper program has been helping organizations become more data-driven. At the same time, we've been able to gather an enormous amount of data from the programs using HomeKeeper in the HomeKeeper National Data Hub. And we've been able to generate dashboards and reports to support the field in documenting that impact. In case you missed it, my colleague helped publish a working paper in partnership with other researchers and the Lincoln Land Institute last year, Vince Wong, and I think he's on the call. He's our research director here at Grounded Solutions Network. It's by far and away the largest and most comprehensive look at 58 shared equity programs with 4,000 housing units in 20 states over 3 decades. It's a fairly comprehensive report. So it was groundbreaking in so many ways, and from it we've been able to cull data stories to share with the sector. There's a few on the right. Maybe you've seen some of them in social media and around over the last year. So for example, the share of minority households living in shared equity homes increased from 13% to 43%, the 2 of the timeframes referenced in the report. And 7 out of 10 of the homeowners are first-time home buyers. So before we get any further, we're using this term data stories a lot today. So just to make sure we're all on the same page, here's the basic idea. A data story is combining data, narrative, and visualizations to explain, engage, and enlighten. They're designed to spark an emotion, convince, justify, inspire, and they create an accessible, memorable narrative. Data stories are powerful, not only what they can succinctly summarize about your work, but also about the power they have to improve or influence others. So they really are intended to prompt action and change. So I know, I don't know about all of you, but definitely some are already using data to tell stories publicly. And I know because I took a quick look at some of your websites and I found some examples of data-driven stories. Just wanted to flag those here. Quick shout out to Belmont Housing on the call, who shared in their annual review how they've helped folks find and maintain affordable housing. 51 seniors remained at their home through reverse counseling, and 195 owners avoided the foreclosure. So you can see how they use the data to back up their top line messaging. Nice work. Habitat for Humanity, Collier County, had a few data stories right on their homepage. They reported a minuscule foreclosure rate and assured donors that 95% of every dollar is going to program services. I love how accessible this data was, super easy to find. Athens Land Trust also on their homepage, they have an impact section also with impressive numbers that align with their mission. And so notice how they use the numbers to back up their claim in the top right, having made significant progress on meeting their mission. Next up, Habitat Greater San Francisco, across the bay from me here in Oakland. Here's a data story they made on a previous webinar that we did, making the case for economic stability and mobility. So they're saying our homeowners are saving money. 83% of their homeowners are putting money aside for at least one saving goal. And they've listed some of the savings goals here. Here's a last example. Meta, also from San Francisco, recently published a brief on the stressors of families earning less than $35,000 a year. And while it's full of fascinating data stories just on this one page, I quoted one I thought was unique. It says, it would take 7 families earning $25,000 a year to afford a 2-bedroom unit in San Francisco. That alone says a lot about the affordability gap and the housing crisis that we're facing. So with that, we're gonna turn it over to an audience participation poll. Bardil is gonna help us get started with that poll. Great, so take a minute.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Because I've launched the poll, so hopefully it shows it as a pop-up for you guys. So please select all that apply on what you guys are doing to tell stories with your data. I see the votes coming in. We'll wait like another 20 seconds. So please send your votes and then we'll share the results with everyone. Okie dokie. Like about 10 more seconds last call. Anyone else want to sneak in? Okay, I will share the results now. Awesome. And Tiffany, you can go ahead and continue if you want to chat about it.
Have a look and see what some of your peers are doing. It looks like everyone is doing pretty well on making progress on some of these measures. Obviously not, it's a journey, becoming more data-driven as an organization, and we are always seeking to do just a bit more than we're already doing. I'm wondering if someone could please share how your journey maturing as an organization has been. Like, how did you do it, or what does it take to move further along on this path? Is there anyone there from the examples that I've shared? Or Meta, I know you're on the call. Do you want to speak up and say a little bit about what it takes to incorporate data at your organization?
Yeah, this is Michelle Reestop. I'm the Associate Director of Data and Learning, our evaluation team. And I've been a part of Meta's journey through using an outcome tracker since 2011. And then a couple of years later, we moved to Salesforce, and HomeKeeper is one of the apps. So that's just the technical journey, but you know, building trust was a big part of moving off of the old system and onto any new system. Our staff did not trust the data or the database because it had been left unmaintained for some time. So I think a critical part of adoption is that I'm a firm believer that you need to invest in the data person first. A good data person can do it all in spreadsheets if they have to, but at least somebody is the caretaker of the data and what it means, and establishing consistency and helping people with it. They have to be a people person too, which a lot of folks don't hire for in a technical role. But I think it's critical. And so that was something that not only was it a big barrier because there was a problem with it, it's something that we have to maintain constantly. Because if there's no faith in it, they won't get used. And then it really is bad data. So there's a lot of those kind of soft skill lessons that I think are have been the most critical to our success and lack thereof, and our failures. So yeah, the person is, and you know, we're lucky that when we found the funds, it took some jerry rigging of some grants initially to fund that role, which was me. And it takes ongoing jerry rigging of grant fund line items to make sure that we can fund our team. But yeah, so the other thing I think I'll say is lessons learned for me was that I wish I'd done this from the beginning, and that is to make data learning and data or data entry adoption a group and communal activity. Too often we train on it, send people on their way, and hope to God they did it. And that's just like building shame and closeted bad behaviors right into your data. So we've tried some new things in recent years, which is just that a team or a group that's working on this similar data schedule some time together to not just learn it and train, but to keep doing it. Put the chart that reflects what they're doing or the dashboard up on a screen and watch as it changes. And inevitably, most of the questions that come up from training have nothing to do with where do I click. They have to do with cultural decisions within a team about all the exceptions and all of the stories behind that data and what you're supposed to do with it once you're faced with a pick list or a date field. So I'd say 90% of the questions that come out of training have nothing to do with where to click, but there are cultural decisions that only that group can answer for each other. So getting everybody in the same room to understand that they're critical teachers of each other, those are the biggest lessons. I'll just stop right there and say well, I'll end with the design of the technical to collect data has to come only after you've decided what's the important story to tell. And then you build to make sure that you're going to be able to tell it. Whether it's the story, the result, the moral of the story is going to be what you hope, and it may very well be what you didn't expect. But either way, you built your data collection to prove it to yourself one way or another.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that. And also thank you for sharing out the stories on your website, so folks can go to Meta and see what it looks like when you have a team dedicated to data and learning at a housing organization, and see some of the stories that have come out of their work. So excellent. Thank you.
Awesome. And I can jump in and also thank Karen for sharing chat that we've used the ability to create custom fields in HomeKeeper/Salesforce to better track outcomes. And then someone also asked a question. I don't know if you want to answer it now or later in Q&A, but the question is, we are located in a rural smart community. We'd love to share what % of homeowners have a mortgage through USDA loan or seniors, etc. We are worried about people being able to guess who is who amongst our homeowners. Any tips for balancing telling data stories while maintaining confidentiality?
I think that is a great question for the other practitioners on the call. So I think if you want to mention any tips that you have for that question, please help your peers out. I would say that generally from our perspective, Grounded Solutions Network, we are sharing data in aggregate form, and we have a benchmark in several circumstances of what I call a very non-technical term, enoughness. Do we have enough data to share that is going to be representative and preserve the priority? So I would probably just quickly say you should set an enoughness standard before sharing that and outing out any particular person. So other folks can chime in. Great. Well, so moving on, thank you all for sharing and starting the discussion. Please continue to share. It's really helpful. Next up, we're going to talk about laying the foundation for creating better stories. So I want to talk through these 10 steps briefly. We can share, in more detail links to where we have a write-up on this, but I do want to just do a sort of lightning round, talk through these 10 quickly. Since we don't have time to, spend a whole day together, which is what we have done in the past, walking through how to create data stories. But all of these really factor in to your new stories that you're going to tell about the pandemic. So let's jump in. First, we've talked already a lot about that. Michelle noted some of her tips about standardizing the data collection. So in addition to collecting the data in the same way, you also want to make sure you're aligning with any national or sector standards that you have. We have 2 handouts on home ownership and housing counseling we can share. Those are good starting point for you in your data collection. And then you also, again, want to track your new metrics get your staff on board with your pandemic era data points. So standardizing the data going in. Next, secondly, finding new insights in your existing data. I like this because you don't necessarily need to create a big research project. You already have a lot of data in your files or in your systems. What do you have that you haven't yet reported on? It's a good place to start. So for example, even a really basic field like date of birth, which you might have in a column in your spreadsheet, can tell you the number of children or seniors that you're working with, the percentage of school-age children, the median age at different points for your clients, as well as in today's era, which homeowners might be more likely to need assistance or might be more at risk. So definitely find those new insights in your data you already have. Clarifying your audience, really who is going to be reading your story. I mean, it's okay to have general broad informational stories on your website. That's sort of the intent and place for all to see, but really you want to start to craft stories for different stakeholders and think about the wide range of folks that you could be reaching. And don't forget your applicants, your clients, and your homeowners, the people you work with, and what data you can share with them to make, so that they can be informed and make good decisions as well. Once you have that audience in mind, you can dive deeper into identifying their interests and their motivations, put yourself in their shoes, think through what decisions they're making, what questions might they have, and craft the storyline with that information so that they have the information they need to act or to make a decision. So here's a photo from one of our past trainings we have done when we have spent half a day on these two points alone. So if we were all in a room together, imagine us busting out a piece of chart paper and talking through these questions. In these examples, you can see here the board was identified as the audience, and they're identifying their interests and motivations around staying on mission, staying in budget, heading in the right direction, and then crafting the storyline about what they might want to hear. So for example, maybe the impact on their community and the types of folks that they're serving, who are the teachers, who are the hospitality workers. And so this is just an example of how you can go about this activity. Next, looking for public data that you can use. So all of this will bolster your case. You can draw from news articles, research, or industry partners. If you're sharing homeowner data with us, you can look to the National Data Hub. You can benchmark your work against your peers and the sector as a whole. So here's an example of how Homestead Community Land Trust used data from the National Association of Home Builders to estimate the economic impact of their program in terms of jobs, wages on the left, and business income, tax revenue on the right. So they can say, we created jobs and economic growth. Our investments in affordable housing contribute to a thriving economy. And they have the data to show it. Next, add a graphic or a pretty picture, as I like to call it. Sounds great to say something like, we put homeownership in reach for mail carriers, grocery clerks, and teachers so they can put down roots in their community. But it's much more convincing to have the data and visuals to show how much more affordable homes are compared to the market for these essential workers. So visuals, as you know, make the data more memorable and your story more effective. And again, you can see here how they've brought in external data from the news and the local multiple listing service. They've brought that in to create this graphic. Nice work, Homestead. Here's another example. I had so many great examples, just picked a few. But here's another great example from One Roof Community Housing in Duluth, Minnesota. They had a beautiful infographics sprinkled throughout their annual report. I would definitely check it out and get some inspiration. You can use many of these storylines yourselves. Excellent work. You can see here how they're showing the income breakdown. They're showing some deeper demographic profiles of who their tenants are, and they sort of have a summary statement up there on the top right. Number 8, make it personal. This seems obvious, but check your websites. Does it include any personal stories? Do your reports or your funding reports profile beneficiaries for your funders? Are you saying like, here's a project we built, or here's what we do? Or are you also showing, here's who we're helping, here's why your donation matters? Here's a nice example from Proud Ground that combines the data stories there on the left with personal stories, and a nice photo. Here's another example from One Roof that I like. You could say you hit 300 homes in your portfolio or served X number of people in your program, or you could celebrate that family. Congrats to One Roof and Bill and his family. Now, once you have those compelling stories, you really need a plan to get out there and tell it. Don't bury it in the corner of your website or print it and not share it. So remember to include it in your newsletters, your annual reports, add them to your website or post to social media. I was looking through some of your social media posts too, trying to find who's pulling in their data stories into the stories that they're telling there. So yeah, definitely make sure you're planning on sharing those stories. Here's another example of Opal Community Land Trust has it right on their website. They have, they're making the case for their work about how they're closing the affordability gap. And they've put interpreted some of their information right there in an easy to reach place. So lastly, I have here at number 10, do a reality check. Completely agree with what Michelle was saying earlier, to start with brainstorming the stories you want to tell. You want to test drive those with your audiences. And then you can back into, can we get the data that we need? Can we honor privacy concerns? And the nitty-gritty details of the implementation. How do we train our staff? What do we need to do to our forms to make sure we're in sync with those stories that we want to tell? So take the time to do a reality check. This is not just about gathering the data for an annual one-time report. This is really about embedding the systems to tell these stories into the work you're doing. Great, so those are the 10 steps to telling better data stories. The examples, as you know, are pretty general to the programs and organizations that you're working. It's been hard, and there hasn't been enough time that has gone by to see, COVID stories popping up in your annual reports and on your websites. And so I think now is really your turn to start thinking about how you're going to be crafting those stories in these in this era. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Lindsay, to help give you some ideas for how you might go about creating these new narratives more relevant to the era that we're in.
Awesome, thanks Tiffany. I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. And as Tiffany said, next I'll be taking you through the 5 story types outlined in the datatherapy.org activity, Finding a Story in Data, and showing some examples of how you can apply this concept to your data and more specifically to your COVID-19 data. These stories can be external for funders, clients, and stakeholders, or internal to improve efficiencies and operations. Just in the interest of time, we're going to be focusing primarily on external storylines today. We'll also share the full activity with you in our follow-up notes so that you can practice applying the concepts at your organization. Next slide. So as I'm sure you often see, simply showing a piece of data to your audience isn't always very engaging. It can often be flat, confusing, or just not very compelling. So when you use multiple types of data stories to tell multifaceted and vibrant stories that appeal to a broader audience and give a more complete picture. Next slide. So the first story type is the factoid story, which is a narrative of facts supported by summarized data. Sometimes this can be in large sets of data that you find the most interesting or one particular piece of information. It could be an outlier, or it could be the data point that is most common. It could be a detail about one piece of your data that fascinates or surprises people. It can also give them an easier way to start thinking about the data set as a whole. Next slide. One great example we saw of how this can be applied to COVID-19 is the chart that was recently released by the Coalition of Housing Professionals, which shows the number of American tenants at risk of eviction in 2020. So here, it's just the sheer volume of renters that are at risk that tell a story in and of itself. Next slide. Here we have 2 examples of factoid stories that you can start telling at your organization. So first, you could show the number of ground lease waivers that you've issued and the dollar amount directly invested in your community stabilization measures. Or you could also show the number of your homeowners that have received mortgage intervention and the dollar amount they're saving each month. Next slide. The next story type is comparison. Comparing between sections of your data can be a good way to find a story to tell. Often one part of your data can tell one story, but another part tells a totally different story. Or maybe there's a smaller portion of your data that serves as an example of an overall pattern. You can compare segments of your data, or you can compare segments to other stories outside of your organization as well. We saw the Census Bureau using this story type in their chart demonstrating the disparities in housing outcomes, which show the higher eviction risks for communities of color and for households with families. One way you could use the comparison type would be to compare the delinquency rates on the open market to the delinquency rates for your CLT homes in the same county following the COVID shutdown. Next slide. So number 3, change stories. People like to think about how things change over time. So telling a story about change over time appeals to people's interest in understanding what causes the change, and they can often remember seeing the differences. The Mortgage Bankers Association shows us a great example of this in their forbearance estimates from the start of the pandemic through today. Next slide. One example we thought of that would be great to show you would be the average net worth of your clients that has changed throughout the pandemic. Okay, next slide. Number 4, an interaction story. An interaction story is when 2 sets of information in your data set seem related, or another term for this would be correlated. For example, if one measure goes up, the other goes up too. If one goes down, the other goes down, or when one goes up, the other goes down. Here's an interaction story we saw from Capital News, Illinois, showing the weekly unemployment claim increase in Illinois as a direct result of the COVID-19 shutdowns. An example of an interaction story that you could tell is to show how your counselors are spending more time with clients as the number of counseling sessions related to COVID increases. So this would show that there's a correlation between staff time and COVID interventions, helping you make the case for increased funding for operations or for increased staffing. Number 5, personal stories. Personalizing a story can create a connection to the real world meaning of your data. And it can be a powerful type of story for small audiences, and it can make the data seem more real to your audience. Next slide. So here we have a great personal story from Habitat for Humanity Greater Los Angeles. And by showing the direct effect that the donors' dollars had on the community, they were able to make a personal connection between the donor and the recipient. Sorry, next slide. There we go. All right, next slide. A personal story that you could tell at your organization is to share the story of one of the clients that you've helped during the pandemic, which can help to humanize the issue and really ground your data. So now that you've seen the examples of each type, you can use the different story types to start brainstorming your own stories. You can also bring all the story types together to tell a more complete and compelling story on your website, through your blog posts or articles, or in your annual reports. And now I'll pass it back to Tiffany to lead you through some participation and discussion.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Hopefully, Lindsay got you thinking about what stories you can tell about this unique period in history. Again, since the pandemic is so new, we don't have too many examples. So I think we wanted to leave enough time for us to have that discussion here and hear from you about the stories that you're hoping to tell about your response or how your community is faring. And so without any further ado, we have another poll. We have highlighted COVID-related themes that we thought were most compelling from what we understand. Feel free to put others in the chat box. And maybe you could vote on the top 3. Pick 3 that you think are the most compelling.
Awesome. I see some of you have already picked your top 3. Looks like a lot of people are interested in a lot of things. So give it like 10, 20 more seconds for people to answer that poll. And if you are having any difficulties with the poll, you can feel free to throw that in the chat, as Tiffany said, or any other themes that you that aren't on this list. So I think most people have voted, so I'll go ahead and share the results.
Great, thanks. So you can see here and look at which of these messaging themes your colleagues feel like resonate the most and the least. It does seem like ability to scale impact and organizational resiliency, those are on the lowest end. So talking about yourself a lot, maybe not so important, which is actually interesting because a lot of folks I did see looking through websites are showing what they're doing, you know, what their staff is doing now in terms of being able to continue to operate. Most of the COVID messaging on websites that I saw were around like hours or where you could find the staff. And that was primarily the information being shared. So maybe think about how you could tell stories more towards linking housing and public health or the local economic impact. Those are some of the highest ones that are referenced here. Super interesting. And again, these are just really themes. So I'm wondering, since we have left time to share, if anyone wants to take a crack at crafting a storyline You do not have to have the personal side or the graphics in the chat box, but a simple storyline. You don't have to have real data that would maybe address any one of these issues, maybe one of the more common ones or the more popular ones. Yeah, can anyone suggest a one-sentence storyline that would fit within these themes that you or other folks may want to use? Give folks a moment to think about it. An alternate question is what kinds of stories are you telling? What does anyone want to speak to? How you're talking about your work now, or how you hope to when you do your next board report or your next annual report? How are you wanting to talk about what's happening right now and the impact in your communities?
I'll jump in and say, please do feel free to chat it or unmute yourself or raise your hand. And I see that Richard said, I saw the two lowest and immediately wanted to make them my top priority. So scaling up and from the starting line is the biggest challenge there. And then Karen said, blank % of our renters lost income due to COVID-19. Thanks to the EFSP, blank % were able to pay their rent and stay in place. So thank you, Karen. And then one more person's Anna says, I have a start of a story, but not sure where to go with it. With so much emphasis on home, we've been inundated with applicants during the pandemic. So what do we do with that? I don't know if you wanted to speak to that, Tiffany.
Sure. I mean, can anyone else help Anna with that story? The emphasis on home is just in everybody's conscience now. It's not like housing is not on top of mind for anybody. So it sounds like there's something about the demand, the increase in the demand that you've seen. Maybe
this is Michelle. Should we speak or just chat?
Yeah, go for it.
I feel like, Anna, that's a lot of what we've got too, is the surge in our need for our services, and compared to the success rate of the deliverables or outcomes we can actually help people attain, are not, they're bad success rates, right? Like they're low numbers, because what this data is really showing us is the need, which I think a lot of the COVID data right now is going to be about exemplifying the great need that is out there and being able to pinpoint what some solutions might be given the challenges that we're seeing delivering our particular services. So while we all want to tell a success story, there's a lot of, in San Francisco anyways, there's a lot of really aimless politicians wondering what the bleep to do right now. So the fact that you can show them some specifics about what the needs are can be powerful.
Thanks, Michelle. And I think that's a really good point. Being able to characterize the demand and the need. And, you know, I haven't seen this graphic or storyline with the numbers, but understanding that it's obviously not new. It's not like an earthquake that just hit. There was a demand, and this has made it worse. And so I think there's definitely an interesting story there, the compounding of so many different crises on top of each other, and how, you know, if you didn't believe there was a housing crisis before, or that these issues didn't exist before, now you really need to take a second look at that. And that's kind of in the urban context. I know there are different storylines in other rural or other areas, but I think it's a good point to characterize the demand and the need. Karen, did you want to say anything more about your notes that you've posted? Thanks for joining and letting us share your examples earlier. Okay, I've seen Karen has posted some notes in the chat box, so please refer to that in terms of stories around the differences between renters and homeowners. And I think that's another interesting angle to look at, how folks are being affected differently and how policies and subsidies matter in different ways to different groups. I think that's what you're getting at. We have a few more minutes. Is there anyone else that would like to share maybe a last example or thought about how you could re-message your data stories from before and frame them in the new era? If not, or as you're talking, I will say this is of utmost interest to us and the HomeKeeper team, and we will continue to monitor your social media feeds and your annual reports and your websites, and really look at the ways at which you're characterizing this period going forward, because I think we just don't have, we have other ways of showing with disaster and emergencies how organizations have been reporting on the impact through that. For example, in the fires that we had several years ago, and understanding how some of the organizations were responding in their communities. But I think the widespread nature of this pandemic is going to make those stories a little different. Let's see. Any final thoughts? Or Lindsay, did you want to chime in, hearing some of these examples?
Sure, yeah, it's really bringing to mind one of the great examples that I saw from One Roof Housing as well. When we were talking to them about what they're doing around data collection and COVID, we saw that they actually created a form assembly form, just a short survey that they sent out to all of their applicants and homeowners to see whether or not their income had been impacted by COVID-19 and the shutdowns, and just to get some more information on them. And then that information was automatically updated into their HomeKeeper so that they could immediately pull real-time reports as the information was pouring in. So I thought that was just a really great way to not only reach out to your community to see what their needs were, but to instantaneously generate some reports.
Great, thank you. That does remind me, I have heard on previous calls, others, I think it's City of Cambridge, who was tracking, they're tracking the people that they've reached out to. How many of the folks that they work with have they been in contact with, to show the depth of their engagement and connection to the people that they're serving. Cheryl also had a question here and a final thought here. If you check the chat box, curious if any practitioners see a compelling story in comparing the impact of COVID versus other disasters that affected your area. So like the increase in requests for program assistance between disasters. Thanks, Cheryl, for sharing that. Feel free to answer if you have anything to say on that. Cheryl is on our HomeKeeper team as well. So thanks for being here, supporting. Great, well, I will wrap up the content portion of this. If there are any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. We will be gathering these stories and sharing the storylines that we come up with and see with you, in the same way that we sort of culled what we've seen, brought you some snapshots from organizations earlier in this presentation. We will be doing the same as time goes on and we start to see these stories emerge from your great work. And yes, one great final thought is that the final, from Karen at Belmont, one thing funders have told us, the final outcome matters, but they want to hear stories about the journey too. Yes, the best stories are about the journey and the struggles along the way. So well put, and a good place to end. Bartle, did you want to take us through some resources or next steps? Close us out?
Absolutely. All right, so we do have a couple of resources next steps. So the next slide is, this will be shared. We'll be sending out an email with the recording and the slides. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see a list of resources. All right. So we'll have the data collection checklist for homeownership, data collection checklist for housing counseling, the case for tracking COVID-19 activities, and more resources for telling data stories. And so another thing we'll have, next slide please, is we do a lot of webinars and trainings, and we do have a HomeKeeper Basics and Beyond scheduled for this fall in October, and so that will be posted on the website very soon. And we're also doing shared equity homeownership and beyond as well later in the fall. So stay tuned for that. They will be on the website very soon. And these are paid training courses. There will be 4 parts each. And then lastly, we are a membership organization. So if you become a member, if you aren't already, you can access online training institute discounts, priority help desk access, a network of peers, startup CLT program, and much more. And I'll also add, for those who are already members, a heads up is that the board's nomination process is open now through September 15th. So like I said, these slides will be shared, and you can click on all these links to follow up that way. And I think those are the resources for now, but keep on the lookout for the follow-up email after this webinar. And so this, as a reminder, this is a presentation from HomeKeeper, the HomeKeeper program staff. And last slide is just thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me or Tiffany or Lindsay. So we really appreciate you all coming, and I hope I didn't see any final questions in the chat, but do feel free to reach out to us at any point, and we're really glad you guys made it. Tiffany, Lindsay, any other closing remarks?
That's it. Thank you all for your time. Hope this was helpful.
All right, have a great rest of your day, everyone.